Hey, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Eric ClaVille. You're tuned into LaVeist and ClaVille. We tell it to you straight the way it is from a black male's perspective. So let's get right to it. We've been doing a series on reparations. This is Reparations Part 2. And what has happened recently in the month of April is a situation out in Los Angeles County where the state and the county is looking at actually giving back land that was taken at Bruce Beach some time ago. And Eric, and you actually were looking at this and turned me on to it. Talk a little bit about what that is actually happening and the significance of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, right now we're at a reckoning with racial injustice, where we have so many people in power and the greater community. When I mention the greater community, I mean the human greater community.
Right, broader community.
Absolutely. It's a coalition where people are really looking at this issue to remedy wrongs of the past. When we talk about reparations, we're not talking about giving people free stuff. We're talking about repairing the damage from the past. So there was a wrong that was implemented that now we have to repair. It doesn't matter how long ago it was, but you got to repair it. And, and of course, we know a lot of people talk about, I didn't participate in slavery or Jim Crow or you didn't and so forth. It doesn't matter. It hurt your ancestors and your ancestors benefited from it. So you have to right the wrong, hands down. Doesn't matter how.
And it undermined and it set up a legacy of wealth building, a legacy of advantage for some people, huge disadvantages for other people, which led to things such as wealth building that happened with certain groups of people and not others. And so even though, like you said, these are wrongs that happened some generations ago, they had generational impact. So here we are now in 2021, and you can see direct lines of poverty, of a lack of development, of disparities, health disparities, and economic disparities all over the place that are directly related to the injustices that happened in the past. So,
look, you're exactly right, Will. And when we started talking about reparations early on, so we've been ahead of the curve in addressing this. And we mentioned Evanston, Illinois, what that small town is doing.
Right
now, fast forward, you mentioned California. So let's take a look at SoCal. What SoCal is doing or has done, the state of California has started a statewide bill to study repairing the damages of the past, reparations of African Americans who were done wrong through society, as you stated, through systematic racism and the like. One thing that happened in Los Angeles is that the ancestors of a Black family was forced out of business nearly 100 years ago by officials of a wealthy coastal city of Los Angeles. And basically, they have been able to recoup their land back.
Wow.
The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, according to the article, voted unanimously to begin the process of transferring beachfront property to the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce, whose once thriving resort in affluent Manhattan Beach was taken under what's called eminent domain 1824.
Wow.
But we know eminent domain, as long as you get the legislators on board, you could take anything under the government control. The question is, what was the issue behind it?
It has to be for a legitimate reason for the government.
Absolutely.
To plan like that.
And racism is not a legitimate reason, right? If the harassment didn't work, then let's take it by a legislative process. If that didn't work, then you do what happened in Tulsa.
Right.
Burn it, kill as many people as you can and burn it down.
And then act like it never happened.
Act like it never happened. So, Will, when we talk about America and we talk about the West Coast and the East Coast, and then couple that with beachfront property, you are talking a wealth out of control. I mean, you're talking legacy of wealth, years, generations upon generations upon generation.
Right.
Because one thing that's not going away is the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. One thing that's not going away is the beachfront on the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. And you recently had some travels, along the East Coast and saw a lot of a lot of that beautiful property and land, all the way down from Florida all the way up.
Right. I mean, and the irony of that, I was just traveling down, Florida and coming up through the Carolinas, coming up through Georgia, the Carolinas, through Virginia, is I spent some time in Charleston, where you have, first of all along the coast of Carolina and Georgia and Florida, you have the Gullah Geechee people who in many ways are that original African American culture fusion that happened. A lot of people don't know that it was in Charleston was the main port by which slaves came in from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. Charleston as a city was built for the purpose of being able to trade and transport and spread and deliver slaves throughout the rest of the colonies at that time. And prior to it, and a lot of it, I was there, and I mean, it is so emotional in a lot of ways, and we got to spend some later time talking about this in more detail. But I took a tour, and we saw downtown Charleston, saw the buildings and the structure, and down in the area where the slaves were actually held. So if you can think of, you got to visualize a marketplace designed for the purpose of breaking, for the selling of human product. So think of a marketplace that is selling, whether it be baskets or whether it be, fruit or whatever, and human property was part of the selling. And so much of our history is right there in plain sight. You can see in the architecture, you see the dungeons where people were held. And the thing that was so painful and mind-blowing about it for me is that you saw the churches that also had this, and many slaves were kept in.
Now, make sure it's the white churches, because we've been doing series on the black church. On this.
Right, the churches at the time.
Well, which churches? The white churches.
Well, absolutely. I mean, because we're talking about in the beginnings before African Americans, before Black people even began really developing the black church in that form. And then you see out in front of the churches and out in front of certain buildings, you see the slave block. It's actually right. They're actually there. And what people are told is that those were step ups or step downs for the carriages. No, those were where the slaves were held and put on the block, and the auctions were held.
Wait a minute, Will. So they're still there.
They are still there. Oh, absolutely. So I talked about the Gullah community, Gullah people, is that they were the peoples who remained there in the area because slaves were brought in, sold, and transported throughout the United States. Those are many of the people who remained, right? And after the Civil War, they were granted lands, right? And after the Civil Wars, they were actually, because of the situation where the lands were situated on the coast, and if you've been in the area, Florida is very swampy, and the lack of access to islands and bridges, they were actually isolated, and they were actually able to develop, because of that isolation, develop the culture much less tainted, by European influences than anywhere else in the United States. And now what is happening is because of the increased value of waterfront property, because of the complex nature of their lands and inheritance and how that works, passing down from generation to generation. And if you don't understand it, you can end up losing their land. So here is a group of people who are very much fighting to preserve their culture, preserve access to their land. And you have here in California, a group of people whose lands were taken away. So you got this complex nature of what it means to be in America. That is just this issue of land and who has it, and getting land and losing land is very much deeply rooted, in our culture and our history, as a people. So, I say all that to say that this reparations thing is not just something of the past. is very much something that is very much alive and is rooted in, in our history and is impacting us today.
Will, I'm glad you were able to, draw history and the present and make it real to us. I mean, a lot of times we talk about policy, we talk about, what should be done in the sphere of implementation and politics and so forth. And we talk a lot about history, but you were able to actually see it.
Yes. See the connection.
Right. And not just see it, but touch it, step on it, walk it. And it's as if you went into the past in the present.
Right. And and I'm gonna tell you, and I mean it, I'm still emotionally trying to process it, what I saw, because one of the more powerful images, you're in downtown Charleston, you see all of these opulent mansions that were built on the foundation of again, the enslavement of human beings, right? And then there are certain parts right downtown in the city where you go right across the street and you see the projects, you see public housing, and you see our people living in poverty. It's like, how do you go one street, you see a mansion, the next street, you see our people, living in poverty. And while gentrification is also going on all at the same time. So it's like you see the system that we live, when people are talking about systemic racism, you see how the system is structured in such a way that a certain group of people are never supposed to rise above a certain standing. Other people are supposed to be able to enjoy heaven on earth, and how it's just continuing to be structured in that way, and how difficult it is to break through those barriers.
Absolutely. When you describe what you saw with the mansions and then squalor right down the street, is you think about the history of plantations. In the front, everything is genteel, well maintained, manicured, and you got free labor that's doing all of that built it, that's maintaining it, and so forth. But in the back, you have the slave quarters, you have the shotgun houses, the shacks, and so forth, where people live in that squalor. So it's as if, like you said, you stepped in the past, you stepped in the past in the present, and you're seeing the future, like you said, with gentrification, because it's beachfront property. It's property that is very, very not just expensive, but very important, to those areas. And we see that happening all over the United States. We saw it happen in Washington, D.C. We see it happening in California. Historical Black areas such as the Watts and other areas are now becoming, less African American. Northern California, you see it happen in San Francisco. Let me tell you, when I went to San Francisco over a decade ago, last time I was there, the treatment of African Americans was just terrible, absolutely terrible. And of course, the treatment of the homeless, and a lot of them were also African American or non-white, it was shameful how they treated those people. And I'm looking at that. And of course, I'm feeling like the young lady that filmed George Floyd's death after they roughed the guy up. I'm like, should I step in here? What should I do? I mean, I wanted to, but at the same time, I'm looking there. I'm saying to myself, this can't be happening, what I'm seeing. So I understand how people are perplexed when you see these situations. But when you talk about reparations, going back to land is the most valuable asset you can have. I mean, when you talk about property, it used to be us, people, right? Now the most valuable asset, and still is land, because they're not making any more, as I used to hear growing up. They're not making any more dirt, young man. Buy yourself.
Right. Well, like you said, land. In the agrarian society, I mean, land is where you work the land to produce food, to sustain yourself, and to be able to sell for others. Now, what's happening in many of these places is that you have developers coming in that, again, legitimately want to use the land for building homes for people to live on, or building resorts and those kinds of things, because these are the things that are going to generate capital. So you're looking at, okay, it's this tension going on between progress and preservation is what I see also, like what I witnessed in South Carolina. You've got the developers want to come in. We all want to be able to go to the Hilton Heads and other places and live our best life. But then there's a price to be paid for that, as a sacrifice, because there's a historic nature of these lands and also cultures that were built around these lands. You can see that story played out with, for example, the Native Americans, where your culture is very much tied to the land.
Yeah.
And if you're being forced to have to adjust to this new kind of society that doesn't see the land in the same way that you see it from a cultural standpoint, how do you adjust? How do you preserve your culture and also adjust and be able to progress in the current society in which you live in? So it's like a real tension that goes on. And oftentimes, those who want to preserve the culture don't seem to be able to innovate in a way that, okay, we can both preserve and we can develop this land so that it can help sustain us. So, like, what do I mean by that? A lot of times you find people selling their land away, right? As opposed to maybe land leasing. So whatever is built on the land, you continue to generate revenue for the land, or what you see happening with Native Americans now. A lot of Native American tribes are saying, well, I'm not going to sell this land. I'll allow you to build something on it that we can generate, revenue from to help the tribe. And so that's part of this. It's like lands were taken. So you got lands were taken unlawfully. How do you repair that harm? And then how do you still move forward in progress in a way that recognizes the new paradigm, new society that we live in, still enables us to be able to maintain, the culture in a certain way. So that's what the Gullah people are facing. How do you maintain some of those traditions that are tied to the land, but as a society, we no longer there. It's like we're not in the 1800s without lights and stuff anymore. So how do you make your culture adjust, to the new situation? So it's a complex thing.
So, I want to continue on this part of our talk of reparations. We're talking about land, and this is part 2. When we talk about solutions, what is happening in California, the statewide bill to study reparations and how to repair the wrongs of the past, utilizing this beachfront property that was given back to the descendants of the family that the land was taken from, and then you looked historically at the Gullah, people who came, part of the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, which we are a part of,
right,
and how they built their society, and then how Native Americans were stripped of their land, and how we're looking at gentrification now, Washington, D.C., we're looking at it here, I was looking at California, looking at Chicago, everywhere, Northern California, gentrification is taking place. So when we delve into and we understand that our land is being taken, and it seems like we're an afterthought. It's like, let's develop this property. What are you going to do to the people there? Let's just push them out to this area.
Yeah, push them where? Yeah.
Right, push them out to this area and pack them into an area so they can learn how to create anew and learn anew, like you said, which is hard to do because you're attached to that area. I remember listening to a piece on National Public Radio, NPR, where they did a story about gentrification, in California, how they were, how growing up in Crenshaw area, Watts area, those areas, it was magical, but it was also complex because it was dangerous, in some areas and so forth. And we understand, the Black intellect movement. We also understand the drug, movement that actually destroyed a lot of families, a lot of communities.
Right.
But still, there's a connection to that. It's like, hey, We can go outside of our house, go down the street, play basketball, play curveball, that type of thing. And nobody thinks that a bunch of young Black boys hanging out playing is an issue. Nobody's going to call the police.
Right.
Somebody sitting on the stoop getting their hair done, combed, on a Saturday, getting ready for church on Sunday. These are things that we were attached to, Will.
Yeah. Part of culture. Nostalgia is part of culture, part of what helped us develop to who we are. Yeah.
Like you from New York, people sitting on the bench, maybe the brownstone.
Sitting on the stoop, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Just chopping it up, right? That's, going back and like Do the Right Thing, that scene, a great Spike Lee movie that should have won Motion Picture of the Year. But was snubbed. It was snubbed because people really didn't want to deal with this topic we're talking about now. But the person being interviewed said it was complex because now we're college educated. We went off to college. And in order to live, quote unquote, have a good neighborhood, you got to move out of the neighborhood that you grew up in, that your identity is attached to.
Right.
And now you move to an area that is impacted by predatory lending.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And now that area is declining, with the downturn of the economy. And then you go back and take a look at your community and it's being gentrified.
It's being gentrified, right.
You can't go back there, but then you in a neighborhood that you can't afford either.
Right.
So now your identity, as you stated, is taken away. So if we look at a Native American model, Native Americans suffer tremendously, just like African Americans in our country. Their land was taken, it was stolen when they didn't want to trade for it or give it up when the war.
Forced to move, oftentimes forced to relocate into, worse land, least profitable type lands. Yeah.
You got the Trail of Tears, which is basically, we romanticize it, but it was a death march.
Yeah, which by the way, included slaves because Native Americans had slaves as well.
Absolutely.
Southern tribe, yeah.
So you're marching these individuals to land that is undesirable and leaving them there and giving them subsidies, giving them food that's bad for their health, just like they gave us pork. Which West Africans were not pork eaters historically because most were Muslim. We did have Christians in there. We had Roman Catholics, but again, we didn't eat that type of food. So you're giving people bread made of a lot of flour, a lot of grease, diabetes increase. You give them fire water,
right?
Which is a lot of alcohol, getting people drunk. So the United States became, in one instance, the corner store. Right, where all the processed foods. So people are now attached to this land, but they've lost that identity.
Right.
But moving forward to make reparations for that, they're allowing Native Americans to utilize their lands in order to create businesses on there, more specifically gaming.
And that's the situation you all have there in Norfolk going on, right? No.
Exactly. So we have, but think about it. Now, I'm glad you brought that up. But they're able to operate tax-free and finally a revenue stream that they can have their own and, again, build up themselves in these United States of America after everything was taken away from them.
Right.
So now you talk about Norfolk. Let's take a look at Norfolk. That casino that's being built, of course, is offered and being built by Native American tribe and being operated as well. I think one or several of them. But it's being built in an African American area that's being gentrified. So, on one hand, we see reparations working, for one group, but we see where still discrimination, gentrification is destroying the other group. Well, and the question is, Will, when you have one of the greatest, probably the largest movement of African Americans in the country, mass movement, which is here in the Norfolk, Virginia area, at this community called St. Paul's and surrounding area. Their people are losing their identity. When they move, they're not going to be able to come back there and afford anything.
Right.
Just like people who lived in D.C. around Howard University, people that lived in South Harlem, which is called Northern Manhattan. Okay.
Right. Well, this is the challenge. Is how do you progress? How do you preserve and also adjust and innovate and continue to recreate your identity and culture within the new context, which is going to be the challenge for the people in California with the beach, which is like, okay, well, now you get that land back. What are you going to do with that land that's going to be relevant to building wealth, to building identity, building, culture within this new, context that we're in 2021? And I say that is like an ongoing challenge of progress of just living life, period. You mentioned DC. I often hear about how people talk about certain areas of DC, whether it be near Howard University or 14th Street or whatever the case. And they talk about how, oh, this used to be the hood and this used to be all black. And my thing is often, okay, but when it was all black, okay, what efforts or what was the stumbling blocks to developing that community so that, like you said earlier, it's not something that we grow up in and say we got to leave? What is this? What are the stumbling blocks? And that's where you come back to the systemic racism that exists, the access to capital, the access to being able to get, loans, for example, to do these kinds of development. The gentrification that we see going on, it's not just people coming in with a whole lot of money just to, discretionary income just to burn, to do this, that, or other. There are city plans that are going on. There are banks who are bankrolling these things because they see the benefit of getting a return on their investment. So why is it that when these areas are predominantly black, we don't have that same type of an investment? And that's where I think, and I hope that the reckoning that we're in now, as you spoke about earlier, is what is going to move us towards to really getting to the root of being able to develop our areas so that we're not feeling like we got to move out, we got to leave, but that we can develop and live abundantly right where, right where we are.
Right where we are. And that's getting to the solution. So in order for us to build our communities back, to build, the Black Wall Street back, to build the Harlem Renaissance back, to build, areas in every city, you had African Americans that did well. Just in my community I grew up in, the gas station was owned by an African American male. We owned the daycare and the preschool. The insurance company was owned by African. The law firm was down the street. You had doctors and lawyers that lived, just driving around the corner from each other, right? The only thing that wasn't owned by an African American was the corner store, where what we called the market. It wasn't a corner store, we called it the market. So it was a small place, kind of like a bodega, but you had a butchery there in the back. You can get everything you needed. And next door to the chain grocery store. And then the bank. Those are the only things that weren't black owned in the community I grew up in. So everybody I saw was African American, male, with families that owned businesses, that did professional work, right? So how do we get back to that place where now we can go back and build it up and say, we don't have to move out of our community. We can invest and buy where we are. That's where we are now. I believe that that's where we need to continue to focus. I think that's one part of solutions to reparations. That's the land that we currently have. There's this movement that they call buying the hood, right? Buy where you live, buy the neighborhood.
That's right. That's right.
Buy where you live. Even if it's $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, buy it, fix it up, improve the property value and the like, and make sure that that's a place that you can not just raise your children, start your business, you can live, and then pass that property on. It doesn't decrease, but increase. But in order to do that, we need to address the issues of systematic racism around land ownership, access to capital, redlining, and improving our community.
Couldn't agree with you more. Take us on home.
Well, again, thank you so much for listening to, LaVeist and ClaVille, as we talk about these important issues. This is our second segment of reparations. We're going to continue to talk about solutions. We know the problem is, now is solution time. If you like this, follow us on our social media, like, share, and also follow on our Facebook or YouTube, and also Acast, listen to our podcast. And if you have any questions, email us at LaVeistandClaVille@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you. Until then, that's the way we see it. That's the way it is. Until next time.